Hi, AP Psych. These are the start of your units 1/2 notes. So in your textbook, we have unit 1 and then unit 2. College Board combines them together. So we're going to be combining these two together. You'll have one unit test at the end. So we're going to be starting with module 1 right at the beginning today of this unit called Scientific Foundations of Psychology. And really the first part is a history lesson, like how did psychology get to where it is today in terms of a discipline? Psychology is a fairly young subject where it really doesn't start kind of hitting its more modern stride as modern as being in the late 1800s is. But in terms of other disciplines, pretty young. We're going to see in just a moment that it has its roots in philosophy and then slowly starts becoming more and more scientific over time, getting to what will end in unit 2 of your textbook. That's more of the scientific methodology, following the scientific method, much as similar to what you would do in a biology or chemistry or any other science class that you've taken. So with that said, we're going to get started. Close my little window here. And here we go. So again, we're starting, as I mentioned, with a little history lesson today. Where did psychology start? How did we get our start? And then we're going to really be walking through what become known as perspectives, psychological perspectives. And what that means is throughout its history, there's been, I don't want to say conflict, it's not like people are having fistfights, but there's been some disagreements over how should we study people's minds, mental abilities, behaviors, etc. Like, how do we do that? Sorry, bell ringing. You can tell I'm recording this at school. So, what does that actually look like? It's hard because in psychology, we're thinking about people's thoughts. Like, how can you study what people are thinking? What does that even look like? So, there's been some disagreements along the way, and we'll be looking at some of those today. So, our learning targets for today are I can recognize how philosophical and physiological perspectives shape the development of psychological thought. I can describe and compare different theoretical approaches in explaining behavior. And finally, I can identify major historical figures in psychology. And just an FYI, for this particular module/unit, you're going to be hearing a lot of names. It may feel overwhelming at first, like, how am I going to remember them all? The vast majority of them, outside of the first couple historical more figures, we're going to be hearing about again and again later on as we study more in depth their individual contributions as we move throughout the course material. So we're going to start way back at the beginning, what we're going to call pre-scientific psychology, kind of ancient times. And as I mentioned before, psychology really has its roots in philosophy. And this is not anything that was happening only in one place. We can see evidence of people thinking about what's going on. We didn't know necessarily, or people didn't call it necessarily our mind, but we were aware that we have thoughts. I have things going on in my head that other people don't have, and is what I'm thinking the same as what other people are thinking? How do you study that? What's the connection between my physical body and those thoughts? So we can see influences that from all over the world. In India, we have Buddha, who talked about this relationship between our sensations, like what is actually can be seen or heard versus how I interpret those things, and how does that interplay with my ideas. In China, we have Confucius, who talked about this power of ideas and having an educated mind. In Israel, we have the Hebrews, who linked our mind and emotions to our physical body. Okay, so these are all kind of precursors to this idea of what eventually becomes psychology. The ancient Greeks kind of give us a little bit more influence. With Socrates and Plato, were both very much focused on this idea of logic. And they thought, if I can just think about it logically in this step-by-step process, I should be able to come to a conclusion. But they were actually refuted by Aristotle, who said, it's not quite just logic. Like, we need some sort of actual data. We need some sort of observation in order to come to these conclusions. And he asserted that knowledge is not pre-existing, Like, we don't just are born with this knowledge that I can just logically think through, but instead comes from my experiences. And we're going to see that built upon in what I'm going to call a more modern era, even though modern in this case is like 1500s to 1600s. But what I hope that you'll see as I talk about each of these ideas is this very slow progression, okay, from general ideas of thinking about the mind and the body to kind of more specifically moving towards a more scientific way of thinking. Okay. So we have Rene Descartes here, who was around in the late 1500s, really for him, mid 1600s, when he was an infant. And he came up with an idea that modern psychology is kind of discredited, but again, just showing that this was something that was being thought about. And this is the idea of dualism. And in his mind, the mind, kind of our thoughts and our physical bodies were separate. And he thought even after we pass away, the mind could go on. Think of it kind of like spirit, body and spirit. Okay. Francis Bacon is really going to be a big shift. Francis Bacon, you may have heard of probably in your science classes. He's in the mid 1500s to 1600s, and he's going to start taking a more scientific approach just in general. It wasn't like he was saying, I'm going to now do psychology. That was not his focus. But what we're going to take from as a discipline, what we take from Bacon, is this idea of focusing on experiments and experiences as we're describing what's going on in our mind, body, brain, etc. Okay. And then another influencer that may not seem like it, because if you've taken Gov or a history class, all kinds of bells today. If you've taken Gov or a history class, I know when I taught world history, I used to talk about him. You've heard of what's often thought of political philosopher, is John Locke. And John Locke said that we're born as a tabula rasa, or blank slate, meaning our minds are kind of empty when we're first born, okay? And that all of our thoughts then become based on the experiences that we have, okay? And this is going to be a really important sticking point when we talk about the psychological perspective, a more modern perspective called behaviorism, okay? B.F. Skinner, just to bring up a name that you've heard before when we talked about language, was a behaviorist. Remember, his language theory focused on experiences and developing language. That kind of comes from this idea from John Locke. So the more modern take, kind of what our psychology is based on today, this is the foundation, is empiricism. And it comes from kind of this combination of Bacon, Francis Bacon, and John Locke, okay? This is the view that our knowledge originates in experience, like doing. And because of that, science should rely on observation and experimentation. So then how does that translate to psychology? If I'm trying to figure out what is going on in someone's mind, mental processes, emotions, what I see, what I hear, what I think, all the things that we study in psychology, it has to be rooted in observation and experimentation. Okay, that's why we're talking about this now. Okay, it has to be rooted in observation and experimentation. It's not just something I can think about logically. It's not just based on my own ideas, okay, my own insights, because we know that sometimes those instincts can be wrong. So we have to rely on observation and experimentation. And we're going to see that throughout the rest of this unit. So where does that take us to? Okay, we're going to focus on first these early theoretical schools of psychology. Again, these were different ways that people thought throughout. We're going to get through from like the 1800s until like the 60s here. Okay, kind of people had different views of how do we approach this idea of psychology? How do we study it? How do we experiment? What does that look like? Okay, so we're going to go through each of these. So we're going to start with the very first kind of theoretical school, and this was something called structuralism. There's two major names that we need to associate with structuralism. This will be the only time I talk about them, so these are two that hopefully stick in your head. The first one is Wilhelm Wundt, or Wilhelm Wundt, okay, if we're not saying it in German, and his student, Edward Titchener, okay? They came up with an idea that they call, or we call, structuralism, okay? So what does that mean, okay? So a structuralist approach is really trying to look at kind of these building blocks or fundamental relationships or structures that we could use to explain people's behavior. Okay, how could they were really trying to like break down psychology, this idea of what are people thinking, our mental processes, our behaviors, and how can I break it down into these kind of building blocks? Think of it kind of similar to chemistry. It all comes down to the elements, okay, on the periodic table. Kind of the same thing. Or physics with its fundamental laws. Like, how can I break it down into these structures that could be used to explain all behavior? Okay. And the way that they did this, the breakdown kind of that they used was something called introspection. Because here's where psychology has a little bit more difficult time and why some people say it's not a real science. I'd refute that. Okay, I'd refute that. It is science. But there's some people that say, nah, I don't think it's real science. I'm using air quotes right now, even though you can't see me. Okay. And here's why. So much of what we study is just based on people's thoughts. And how can you scientifically look at what someone is thinking? There's no way to know what someone is thinking unless they tell you what they're thinking. So one of the main kind of methods that Wundt and Titchener used was something called introspection. And what that basically is if I want to know what someone's thinking, I ask them to tell me what they're thinking. So when they experience something, I'm going to have them tell me what they're experiencing. Okay. Sounds decent, right? So as someone is doing tasks, and we're going to talk about the first psychological experiment here in a minute, but when they're doing those experiments or doing these tasks, in order to really know what's going on in someone's head, I have them tell me what's going on in your head. That's introspection. Sounds okay, but here's the problem. We know that people aren't always correct, okay? That just because I think something is happening a certain way doesn't mean it actually is. So because of that, it can be unreliable. So first, let me explain this first experiment, and then I'll give you a little bit more. So psychology's first experiment is credited to Wilhelm Wundt. And because of that, he's often referred to as the father of modern psychology. So if someone were to ask you, who was the first psychologist? Your response should be Wilhelm Wundt. Okay. He was at the University of Leipzig in 1879. And what he was studying was reaction times. Okay, reaction times. So doing things like asking people to listen to a sound and then react to it in some way, like say they had heard it or push something saying that they'd heard it, etc. Okay. And what he did as a result of this is really distinguish the difference between sensation and perception. Sensation being the very biological processes that are going on, like when I see or hear something, and then perception being what is my interpretation of what I see, hear, etc. His first student, one of his students, just because I have it on here, is a man named G. Stanley Hall. He starts the first psychological lab in the United States in 1883. He's the first president of the American Psychological Association and the president of Clark University, very big in psychological history. I got to go there a few years ago. It's the only American university that Freud visited. Kind of cool. It's in Worcester, Massachusetts, a few hours outside of Boston. Still there. You can go study there. Okay. So here's what he found. Let's go back to Wundt. Here's what he found as a result of this experiment. Okay. He found, again, this difference between sensation and perception. And he discovered this when he realized that if he asked people to listen to a sound and respond to it as soon as they heard it, they were much faster than when they had to also say what they heard. So the processing and categorizing of sound took longer than the hearing of it, which indicated to him that perception is a process that's separate but related to sensation. Okay. And the way he was able to do that again is through that idea essential to structuralism of introspection. Okay. But again, just to reiterate, I know I'm kind of jumping all over the place. It's because these ideas on these two slides are intertwined. Okay. Again, the problem with introspection is that people's descriptions of their own feelings and reactions are often wrong. So let me give you another example like that. Okay. Let's say that Wundt was trying to figure out what is the softest sound that a person could hear. So what he might do is play a sound and then ask the person if they could hear it. And by asking them if they could hear it, he was relying on introspection, meaning they had to tell him whether they were hearing it or not. But here's the thing. If they expected to hear a sound, they might think they heard one even if they didn't. Okay. And then he might come to the conclusion if I say, I'm listening for a sound and I'm expecting a sound. So he asked me, did you hear the sound? And I'm listening and I go, yeah, I heard it. Okay. But maybe I didn't actually hear a sound. And then he thinks that human beings can hear softer sounds than they actually can. If you've ever taken a hearing test, they put headphones on you and you have a button where they literally kind of do the same thing that Wundt did, where they play sounds in your ears at different times and they ask you to push the button every time you hear the sound. Well, sometimes I know when I've had a hearing test, I'll question myself like, did I hear it? Did I not? I think I heard it. Push the button. Okay. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I didn't actually hear something when there was a sound or vice versa. Okay. So that's why introspection is a little bit dicey. So that was a very long-winded way of saying, okay, that while structuralism had, was well-intentioned, maybe not the most accurate way, okay, to think about psychology. So this is going to usher in a new way of thinking about psychology, okay, called functionalism. And this was the kind of brainchild of William James. Okay, so that's who you see in this picture here, William James. William James is often credited as being the father of American psychology. Okay. So James thought that Wundt's method of trying to understand mental processes by self-reports just wasn't going to work. Okay. And he thought that the method of measuring would always change what psychologists were trying to measure. So depending on the methodology that I'm using could shift my results, essentially. So James instead took his influence by someone who was very popular at the time. I know you've heard about him, Charles Darwin. Okay, this is Darwin's theory of natural selection. Okay, and instead of this measure, like trying to come up with these building blocks like structuralism, James decided it was better to question why, focus on the why. Why do we behave the way that we do? So he wanted to understand behavior in terms of its function in our lives. How does it help us? How does it hurt us? Why do we do some things more than others? Okay. So as Darwin answered questions about physical features, like what advantages did humans gain by evolving to stand upright, James answered questions about behavioral features, like why did humans experience jealousy? Okay. So if we look here at this definition of functionalism, it's really looking at these mental and behavioral processes. How do they help me as a person, or how do they help an organism adapt, survive, and flourish? Okay. So just to give you a side-by-side comparison, structuralists sought to identify what the mind and consciousness were, like the building blocks, think the structures, through self-reported introspection, where functionalists sought to identify how the mind and consciousness worked. Okay, the why, the how. Okay. So why certain behaviors were helpful and others were not. So if I were to describe, I put a picture of an eye here. Okay. If I was a structuralist, I might have you look at something. Okay. And then I would have you self-report. Tell me about what you're seeing. Okay. Where a functionalist would look at each of these individual parts here that you see. We'll be learning this later in the year. And look at, why do these work the way that they do? How do they help me do the behaviors that I need to do? Okay, and looking at the why, how does it work? How does it actually function, to use the same word? If you're not totally lost yet, or hopefully, just to add to your understanding, I have a short video for you here.
Modern research owes a great debt to the innovations of such researchers as Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt designed the first controlled research in a lab setting, and his approach was later known as structuralism. In this setting, Wundt and his colleagues studied perception. Some experiments simply involved recording how the subject responded to sounds, or how the subject reacted to the dropping of a large rubber ball. Wundt also developed the method introspection, where he asked subjects to report their feelings and sensations after dropping the ball to the ground. Although Wundt believed that he could gain insight into how the brain works by asking subjects how they feel, this approach was criticized for being unreliable and prone to bias. His methods as a whole were often criticized for being too narrow or subjective. In 1890, William James attempted to explain how consciousness functions with his book The Principles of Psychology. Because James's theories attempted to explain the function of consciousness rather than the structure, his approach was appropriately named functionalism. James borrowed heavily from Darwin's ideas that mental processes evolve over time to aid the overall survival of humans. Although the early psychologists may have disagreed over how to conduct research, these clashes led to improvements in the science and shaped the methods used today.
Okay, so hopefully that helped to clarify some for you. I want to see how you're doing. Have some retrieval practice here for you. So I'd like you to explain the difference between structuralism and functionalism as best you can in your own words. Okay, I'm going to start class with this when I see you on Tuesday or Wednesday. So if we're still confused, hopefully I can clarify for you then. For now, we're going to move forward. Okay, I'm going to give you a little disclaimer before we move forward. Okay, one thing you might notice as we go through this course, some students have brought this to my attention, not that I didn't notice on my own, I did. But there are like a whole bunch of people that are listed by the College Board of famous psychologists who did great things, made huge contributions to the field. But they all tend to be men and they all tend to be white. Okay. There are lots of other people. There are lots of women. There are a lot of people of color who also made very significant contributions to the field. And I will do my best and be more cognizant about bringing them in as we get to their specific fields of research. But right now, you're after these women, it's about to be the parade of old white guys for the most part, because that's what College Board emphasizes in the course. But again, I'm going to try to do my best to diversify so you know that there were lots of other people that also made contributions too. Okay. These are two early women in psychology that we need to be aware of. The first, her name was Mary Wilkins Calkins. She was actually a student of William James at Harvard. And the interesting thing about Calkins is she did all of her coursework, did all of her studies, was a student in James's lab. And because she was a woman, she was denied her PhD. At that time, Harvard was not offering PhDs to women. They offered to give it to her from their affiliated women's college. She did not want that. But that did not stop her in terms of her success in the field. She became the American Psychological Association's first female president. The other person we have here is Margaret Floyd Washburn. And because Calkins was denied, Washburn became the actual first female with a psychology doctorate. There we go. She became the second female APA president. I will say that in terms of the American Psychological Association, there have been a lot of female presidents, as well as people of various races and ethnicities as well. However, she did face discrimination in another way. She was barred from joining the Society of Experimental Psychologists, which was limited to men only. Okay, so now we're going to go into those theories. Okay, the women were like a little side look, but we're going to go into these different schools of thought. Okay, just FYI, this will not be your only exposure to them. We will be talking about them a lot throughout the course, so think of this as a little appetizer. Okay, so the first person is someone that you've at least heard his name already in our last unit in relation to repression. So this is Sigmund Freud. If you've heard of a psychologist before this class, it was probably Freud's name. Okay? Freud is the founder of an area of psychology called psychoanalysis. And the key thing to understand about psychoanalysis is he liked to focus on what happened in someone's childhood and our unconscious mind. So he believed our mind was broken up into like 3 components. And the main one he focused on was unconscious. This was the part of our mind that Freud said we don't even have access to. That's the part of our mind where any deep, dark secret, anything that happened in our childhood, like I'm going to bury it down deep. It'd be like digging a 6-foot hole, and I'm going to put all those scary things that make me uncomfortable down in the hole, and I'm going to cover it with dirt, and I don't want to think about it. Okay. But Freud would say, even though they're buried in the hole and you don't want to think about them, they still affect your behavior. And all of his therapeutic techniques, all of the things that he did were meant to uncover or dig up those unconscious thoughts. Okay. Time went on, and for a while, psychoanalysis, Freud's ideas were really big in psychology. He talked all around the world. He wrote books. He was really big into dream analysis. Huge thing. There are still some psychologists today that put a lot of weight in Freud's theory. I will say that most modern psychologists as a whole maybe give him credit for some things that they still think is viable, but there's a lot that's been debunked, discredited, etc. So then we get ushered in with this new group of psychologists called the behaviorists. And they are in direct reaction to Freud's psychoanalysis. Freud was very much intangible. Okay, think about unconscious mind. How can you prove that's true? Where the behaviorists said, no, we're not going to think about that unconscious mind crap. We want to focus on objective science and what can I physically see people do. Okay, I can't study people's thoughts, but I can study their behaviors. Okay, so they said that psychology should be 1, an objective science, and 2, studies behavior without reference to mental processes. Okay, and just so you know, most research psychologists today agree with 1, that it should be an objective science, but even if we study behavior, we still need to take into account mental processes as well, those thoughts. Okay. Who we have here is one of the first behaviorists. His name was John Watson, and his research assistant, Rosalie Rayner. So they conducted what become known as the Little Albert experiments, 2 of the most unethical experiments. I will talk to you a little bit more in class, but they involve an infant and a bunny rabbit and some conditioning to the point to where the infant becomes deathly afraid of bunny rabbits, any sort of furry stuffed animal, because of what Watson did. Okay. Main thing you need to know now is Watson was a behaviorist. We'll go into detail about his experiments later on this year. This should be a familiar name. Another behaviorist is B.F. Skinner. Skinner also emphasized the study of observable behavior. His focus, I have just conditioning here, but really it should be on operant conditioning, things like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. And his research focused on this idea of how do consequences affect behavior. And a consequence could be something seen as good or something seen as bad. So for example, if you're a teacher in an elementary classroom and I give a sticker as a consequence because the kid was sitting quietly, okay, how does that affect their behavior? Okay, Skinner would say it makes them more likely to do that behavior again. But again, notice the focus is on behavior, observable behavior itself, not on our thoughts. So what I'd like you to do before I move on, we're almost done, is how is the psychoanalytic perspective different from the behavioral perspective? Okay, so hopefully you said something along the lines of, in the psychoanalytic perspective of Freud, it was focused on the unconscious mind and childhood experiences, where the behavioral perspective was literally focused on people's observable behavior. What can I see them do? Okay. What hopefully you've noticed is each of these additional perspectives or schools of thought are in reaction to their predecessors. So in the 60s, let's say this is the main, late 50s to 60s, we're going to have another kind of group of psychologists that become known as the humanists or humanistic psychology, who thought that the behaviorists made it too cut and dry, that it's not realistic when talking about human beings to not think about their thoughts. Okay. But they also thought that Freud's psychoanalytic unconscious mind stuff, that's too limiting. We can't really prove that's true. So they wanted to take psychology in a new direction. Okay. And what they focused on is the growth potential of healthy people. Okay. And by healthy people, I mean people like Freud with psychoanalysis were really focused on people who had mental illnesses, who were struggling, and that's where they spent their time. Where humanistic psychology with people like Carl Rogers, that's who you see my mouse moving right now in this bottom picture, and Abraham Maslow here in the top picture, they thought that while we do need to focus on mental illness, what about people that are doing relatively well? How can we improve their lives even more? How can we get people that maybe aren't to the point of having a mental illness but are struggling a little bit? How can we help them live better lives? Okay. To put it like very bluntly, and this isn't the most accurate, but I think it'll kind of help hit home a little bit. The humanistic psychologists would be the ones that give the stereotypical therapist response of how does that make you feel? And they were very much involved in asking people questions, letting the person do the talking about what's going on with them, and helping the person come to their own conclusions. Okay. Again, we keep getting a little bit more. In the 1960s, we see even more of a revolution with this kind of linking between biology and neuroscience with cognition, what we've just talked about. So in the 1960s, we have what's called the cognitive revolution. And we're going to start combining what we know about the brain, what we know about how the brain works, with the way that we think and perceive and memory and language. So, forgot I had that next. That's all I have for you. Again, most of these things we're going to talk about again. We will spend a little bit of time in class going over this. I don't have a ton of activities for you, but I am going to talk about it some. I'll clarify any questions you might have. And then we're actually going to do Module 2 together in class, so those won't be separate notes. So with that said, I have a little bit of retrieval practice for you. Okay, so our first question is, by seeking to measure atoms of the mind, who established the first psychology laboratory? I'll go ahead and choose. So on this one, I did not highlight on the next slide, so I'll just tell you. The correct answer you should have chosen is C, Wilhelm Wundt. Okay, next question. Who coined the term tabula rasa to help explain the impact experience has on shaping an individual? Go ahead and respond. Okay, the correct answer here, you should have chosen E, John Locke. Next. Which of the following describes the research typical of Wilhelm Wundt's first psychology laboratory? Okay, here you should have chosen C, measuring the reaction time between hearing a sound and pressing a button. And our last question, with which of the following statements would John B. Watson most likely agree? Go ahead and choose. And the correct answer here was also C, psychology should focus on observable behavior. That is the end of our notes. Again, I will answer any questions you have in class when I see you. I hope you all have a great rest of your day.